Early fall in the suburbs of Boston always held a special charm. The old maples along Oak Street were already beginning to change color, painting the area in warm shades of gold and purple. Melody Worthington loved this time of year best. It inspired her to create new paintings. She sat on the small veranda of their two-story house, working on another sketch. Her thin fingers, stained with charcoal, glided quickly across the paper, creating fanciful lines and shadows. In her 18th year, she was already one of the most promising students at the art college, and her teachers had a bright future for her. Helen Worthington watched her daughter through the kitchen window, machine stirring her morning coffee. Her anxious thoughts were far removed from the peaceful picture outside the window. Her brother, Wesley Whitaker, whom she hadn't seen in the past 7 years, was due to arrive today. 7 years, a sentence he was serving in a Massachusetts correctional facility. The sound of a cab pulling up pulled both women out of their studies. Melody put aside her sketchbook and stood up, smoothing the creases in her favorite denim overalls. Helen hurried to the front door, wiping her sweaty palms on her apron as she went. Wesley Whitaker appeared taller than Melody remembered him. Slim, with sharp features and deep-set gray eyes, he looked older than his 42 years. His sparse blonde hair was neatly slicked back, and in his hands he held a tattered gym bag, all of his possessions from the past 7 years. "Helen," his voice sounded hoarse, as if from a long silence. His sister rushed to him, hugging him with tears in her eyes. Melody was left standing on the veranda, feeling awkward at the sight of this emotional scene. "And that can't be Melody." Wesley pulled away from his sister and looked at his niece. "The last time I saw you, you were just a child." "Hello, Uncle Wesley." Melody walked down the steps and hugged him awkwardly. He smelled like cheap soap and something subtly execrable. The next few hours were spent trying to mend their broken communication. Helen fussed in the kitchen preparing a holiday meal, Melody helped set the table, and Wesley sat in the living room looking at the family photos on the walls. "Are you still painting?" he asked, pointing to one of Melody's paintings hanging above the fireplace. "Yeah, going to art college," the girl replied, setting the plates down. "Going to be an illustrator." "Good business," Wesley nodded. "Clean, creative." Over lunch, Helen told her brother about the last 7 years of their lives, how Melody had graduated with honors, how Helen herself had been promoted at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where she worked as a nurse in the emergency room. Wesley listened more than spoke, nodding occasionally and asking short questions. "I got you a job," Helen said, pouring tea, "at my friend's construction company. You'll start next week if you want to." "Thanks, sis." Wesley smiled for the first time all day, but the smile didn't touch his eyes. "You always take care of everyone." After lunch, Melody went up to her room. She needed to finish her sketches for tomorrow's class. Through the open window came the voices of her mother and uncle sitting on the veranda. They were talking softly, but some phrases still reached her. "Changed there?" The mother's voice was anxious. "Everything changes a person," Wesley replied. Melody closed the window and turned up the music. She didn't want to hear this conversation. She immersed herself in her work, trying not to think about how their lives would change with the arrival of Uncle Wesley. There was a new school semester ahead of her, preparations for her first serious exhibition, meetings with friends, the ordinary life of an ordinary 18-year-old girl. Outside the window, dusk was fading, coloring the sky a deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was brewing. Melody looked at her watch. It was almost 9 o'clock. There was the muffled voice of the television and quiet footsteps coming from downstairs. It sounded like Uncle Wesley hadn't gone to bed yet. She yawned and reached for the phone. She needed to call Esther to discuss tomorrow's composition class. It had been 2 weeks since Wesley had been at the Worthington house. October had been unusually cold, and in the mornings the puddles were covered with a thin crust of ice. Melody hurried to the college, wrapped in a bulky scarf and struggling to hold a large folder of work. The workshop was in its usual bustle. Professor Barlow, a gaunt man with a gray beard, walked around the students, commenting on their work. He stopped by Melody's easel and took a long look at her new painting, a surreal landscape of city buildings intertwined with tree branches. "Miss Worthington," "Your work has been selected for the fall exhibition," he announced. "This is a great honor for a freshman. You have 3 weeks to prepare a series of works." Melody felt her heart beat faster. The fall exhibition was a major event, with gallerists and collectors from all over Boston attending. It was a chance to make a name for herself in the art world. At home, she found Wesley reading the newspaper with the job ads. Most of the jobs were crossed out in red marker. The construction job Helen had found had fallen through. The owner of the company refused to take an ex-convict. "How was your day?" Wesley asked, not lifting his eyes from the paper. "I've been selected for the exhibition," Melody put the kettle on. "There's a whole series of works to be prepared." "Art should serve a higher purpose," Wesley said suddenly. "I was at St. Paul's yesterday. You should have seen those stained glass windows. That's real art. It glorifies the creator." Melody remained silent. In the last few days, her uncle had been talking more and more about religion. He attended service every Sunday, and a battered Bible appeared on the bedside table in his room. In the evening, when Helen returned from duty, they sat down to dinner. Wesley said a long prayer before the meal, a new habit to which his sister and niece still could not get used. "I've gotten a job at the print shop," he reported. "True, only part-time. The owner is a man of faith and understanding." "That's wonderful," Helen rejoiced. "When do you start?" "Monday. I'll be working with the printing press." Wesley set his fork aside. "You know what we'll be printing? Religious pamphlets. It's a sign." Melody noticed her mother frown worriedly. Her brother's religiosity was beginning to worry her. The next day, Melody worked late at the studio. Her new series was to reflect the theme of transformation, how the urban environment was changing nature and vice versa. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice it was getting dark. As she walked back home, she saw a light in the living room window. Wesley was sitting in a chair, reading his Bible by the light of a table lamp. His lips moved soundlessly. "You're late," he pronounced without raising his head. "Working on the paintings for the show." Melody headed for the stairs. "You know what I'm thinking?" Wesley finally looked at her. "About cleanliness, about how important it is to keep yourself clean in this corrupt world." His gaze was strange, almost feverish. Melody muttered a good night and hurried to her room. She spent the next few days mostly at the college or the city library working on sketches. At home, it became increasingly uncomfortable. Wesley could talk for hours about sin and redemption, about the need to purify the soul. He hung religious calendars on the walls of his room and began collecting pamphlets that he printed at the print shop. On Friday night, while Helen was on duty, Melody heard her uncle talking to himself in his room. His voice rose to a shout, then dropped to a whisper. She distinguished the words unclean and punishment. In the morning, Wesley acted as usual, as if nothing had happened. He made breakfast and talked about plans to attend the evening service. But something in his eyes made Melody feel vaguely uneasy. She decided to concentrate on preparing for the exhibition. The opening was less than 2 weeks away, and she had at least 3 more pieces to finish. Art had always been her refuge, a place where she felt safe. She needed it now more than ever. The morning began with a bout of nausea. Melody barely made it to the bathroom in time to vomit up last night's dinner. For the past 2 weeks, she'd been putting it down to the stress of the show, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew it was something else. She bought a pregnancy test at the drugstore on the corner of Maple Street. The elderly cashier gave her a judgmental look, but Melody didn't care. She stashed the purchase in her backpack and hurried to the college, where her best friend Esther Price was waiting for her. Esther was the complete opposite of Melody. Red-haired, freckled, she studied sculpture and had a straightforward judgment. They'd met on the first day of class and had been inseparable ever since. "You look lousy," Esther declared when she met her friend in the hallway. "What's wrong?" Melody silently pulled a test out of her backpack. Esther whistled and dragged her to the second-floor restroom, which was usually empty at this time. The 5-minute wait seemed like an eternity. When 2 stripes appeared on the test, Melody felt the ground go from under her feet. Esther hugged her as she cried silently, snuggled into her friend's shoulder. "Is that Jeremy?" Esther asked when Melody had calmed down a little. Jeremy had been her boyfriend her senior year of high school. Their relationship had ended at the beginning of the summer, when he left to go to California to study. The breakup had been painful, and Melody had tried to forget herself in casual liaisons. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe him. Maybe that guy from Sarah's party. I've been such a fool, Esther." "Hey, stop blaming yourself." Esther pulled tissues out of her bag. "How long do you think?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. I've only missed one period. I thought it was because of stress." They skipped the first couple, sitting in a small coffee shop near the college. Esther helped her friend make sense of the situation, jotting down options in her notebook. "Okay, let's go in order." She tapped her pen on the paper. 1. Are you sure you want to keep the baby? Melody hesitated. The thought of abortion made her physically uncomfortable, but she couldn't imagine being a mother at 18 either. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I need time to think about it and talk to my mom." "What about your uncle?" Esther asked cautiously. "He lives with you now, doesn't he?" Melody shuddered. The thought of Wesley's reaction frightened her more than anything. His religious fanaticism was becoming more noticeable, and his talk of purity and sin more frequent. "Uncle can't find out," she said firmly. "At least not until I figure out what to do on my own." The next few days turned into torture. Melody tried to concentrate on preparing for the exhibition, but her thoughts kept returning to her situation. She began to notice changes in her body. Her breasts became painful. There was a strange sensitivity to odors. Working on paintings suddenly took on a new meaning. New motifs appeared in her landscapes. Intertwining branches began to resemble a mother's embrace. City buildings seemed like protective cocoons. At home, she tried to keep to herself as usual, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The mornings were especially hard. She had to cover the sounds of vomiting with the sound of the bathwater. Helen was too busy working to notice the changes in her daughter's behavior, and Wesley spent most of his time either at the print shop or at church. On Friday night, Melody decided to talk to her mother. She waited until Wesley left for the evening service and went down to the kitchen where Helen was preparing dinner. But the conversation didn't take place. As soon as Melody opened her mouth, the phone rang. There had been an accident at the hospital, and more nurses were needed. Helen hurriedly packed up and left, leaving her daughter alone with unspoken words. At night, Melody couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. From downstairs came the muttering of the television. Wesley was watching the religious channel again. At one point, she heard his footsteps on the stairs and held her breath, but he passed her door. The next day, she met Esther in the park. A friend brought printouts with information about crisis pregnancy centers and phone numbers for psychologists. "You have to tell your mother," Esther insisted. "She's a nurse. She'll understand and help." "I know," Melody rubbed the sleeve of her sweater. "It's just that every time I gather my wits, something gets in the way. It's like the universe itself is against this conversation." They sat on the bench for a long time, watching the leaves fall. Fall was in full swing, and the air smelled of leaves and smoke. Melody thought about the fact that in 9 months it would be spring, and if she decided to keep the baby, her life would change forever. "I can't stop painting," she said suddenly. "Whatever I decide, I won't give up art." "Of course you won't quit," Esther squeezed her hand. "You're too talented for that, and no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." That evening, Melody sat in her room, working on a new painting. From the ajar window came the noise of passing cars and the barking of a neighbor's dog. Suddenly she heard the front door slam. Her mother had returned. "Now," Melody whispered, putting aside her brushes. "It's now or never." She went down to the first floor, gathering all her courage. But Wesley was in the kitchen. He was looking for something in the refrigerator. When he saw his niece, he smiled his strange, absent smile. "How's your exhibit?" he asked. "I hope you're creating something worthy." "Yes, Uncle Wesley." Melody trailed off toward the stairs. "It's going well." Walking back up to her room, she pulled out her phone and texted Esther. "Couldn't make it. Again. Talk to you tomorrow?" The reply came instantly. "Sure. Everything will be fine. I promise." Melody lay on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. Her hand involuntarily rested on her stomach. Somewhere in there, still tiny, a new life was being born. and she still couldn't decide if she was ready to be a mother. It was beginning to rain outside the window, and the drops drummed on the eaves, as if counting down the time she was running out. The end of October was unusually cold. It was raining for the third day, turning the fallen leaves into a slippery mess. Melody sat in her room, trying to concentrate on the last painting for the exhibition, but the colors wouldn't go on right. The smell of solvent made her nauseous, and her head ached from lack of sleep. The atmosphere in the house was oppressive. Helen was working overtime at the hospital, trying to earn extra money before the holidays. Wesley, who had been fired from the print shop for excessive religious zeal, now spent his days wandering around the house, muttering prayers and making notes in his Bible. The walls of his room were hung with clippings from religious magazines and handwritten quotations from Scripture. Even in the bathroom, there were pamphlets about sin and redemption. Helen tried to talk to her brother, but he only waved her off, saying she was caught up in worldliness and doesn't see the true light. Melody only went down to the kitchen when she was sure her uncle was praying in his room. His presence became physically uncomfortable. He could sit for hours in the living room, staring fixedly at one point, or walk around the house in the middle of the night muttering to himself. One morning, as Melody was getting ready for college, Wesley blocked her path in the hallway. "You wear your makeup too brightly," he said, looking intently into her face. "It attracts impure looks. A woman should be modest." "It's just mascara, Uncle Wesley." Melody tried to sidestep him. "It starts small." His voice grew harsher. "First the mascara, then the lipstick, then... Promiscuity is everywhere. I've seen it in prison, seen how depravity eats away at souls." Melody muttered something inaudible and stalked out of the house. All day, she couldn't escape the memory of the strange glint in her uncle's eyes. At college, a new problem awaited her. Professor Barlow noticed that her recent papers had become more disturbing. He asked if everything was all right, but Melody dismissed it with generalities about being tired before the exhibition. That evening, she called Esther. Her friend was the only person she could talk to, frankly. After making sure Wesley was busy watching a religious program in the living room, Melody settled on the bed with the phone. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered into the receiver. "Uncle is getting weirder and weirder. Today he gave me an interrogation over my mascara, can you believe it? Maybe you should stay with me for a while," Esther suggested. "My mom wouldn't mind." "What about the exhibition? I have to finish the artwork," Melody sighed. "And then, I still haven't told my mom about the pregnancy. It's almost 2 months now. It'll be noticeable soon." "Jesus, Melody, how long can you procrastinate? You have to..." Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Melody froze, listening. Silence. Only the television continued to chime downstairs. "Hold on a second," she whispered into the receiver. Melody walked cautiously to the door and listened. There was intermittent breathing behind the door, then distant footsteps. She went cold, recognizing her uncle's heavy footsteps. "Esther!" Her voice trembled. I think he was eavesdropping. Uncle Wesley was standing under the door. "Damn! Are you sure he heard something?" "I don't know. God, what am I going to do?" At that moment, there was a rumble from downstairs. It was Wesley slamming the door to his room with force. Then followed a silence so deep that Melody could hear her own heart pounding. After days of rain, the sky had finally cleared. The cold November sun lit up the deserted streets of the suburbs. Melody woke up early. She was suffering from morning sickness again. Helen was on night duty at the hospital, and the house was unnaturally quiet. When she went down to the kitchen, Melody found a note from her mother. "I'll be at the hospital until tonight. Lunch is in the fridge. Love, Mom." The girl crumpled the note. Another day alone with Uncle Wesley. After that evening, when he had overheard her conversation with Esther, the atmosphere in the house had become unbearable. Wesley had stopped talking to his niece, only staring, a long, scrutinizing gaze that sent shivers down her spine. His prayers grew louder, more frenzied, especially at night. At college, Melody could barely concentrate on her classes. The exhibition was less than a week away, and the last painting was still unfinished. Esther had insisted that her friend move in with her, if only temporarily, but Melody had hesitated. She couldn't leave her mother alone with her obviously unwell uncle. When she got home after class, she went up to her room. She needed to work on the painting, but her hands were shaking and the smell of paint made her nauseous. Melody opened the window, letting in the cold air. The ringing of the phone made her wince. It was Esther. "How are you? Why don't I pick you up at my place tonight?" "Not tonight." Melody lowered her voice. "Mom will be back late. I promised I'd wait for her. I need to finally tell her." Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. Wesley stood on the threshold, pale, with drops of sweat on his forehead and a wild look in his eyes. "So it's true." His voice was hoarse. "You carry sin within you." Melody dropped the phone. On the other end of the line, Esther was yelling something. "Uncle Wesley, I can explain." "Explain?" He stepped into the room. "What can you explain? How you defiled yourself, how you let a demon into your body." His hands were shaking, and his eyes were red as if he hadn't slept in days. Melody crept toward the window. "I heard you talking," Wesley continued, taking another step. "Heard you whispering at night, making plans. You think I don't know what goes on in this house? The Lord has opened my eyes." "Please, Uncle Wesley." Melody felt her back rest against the windowsill. "Let's wait for Mom. Let's all talk together. Your mother is blind." He shook his head. "She can't see evil, but I do. I must cleanse this house." Out of the corner of her eye, Melody noticed movement in the window. A neighbor's car appeared on the street. If she screamed, maybe. But Wesley was faster. In a single leap, he crossed the distance between them. His arms closed around the girl's neck. "Forgive me, Lord," he murmured. "I'm doing this in your name." Melody tried to scream, but only a sob escaped her throat. Her uncle's fingers were like steel bars. Her eyes went dark. The room swam before her eyes. The last thing she saw was Wesley's face contorted with religious ecstasy and snow falling outside the window. When Helen Worthington returned home late that night, the house was empty. An untouched cup of tea stood on the kitchen table. A light was on in Melody's room, an unfinished painting on an easel. Her daughter's phone was on the floor, the screen shattered. And in the mailbox was an invitation to an exhibition of young artists that was due to open in 5 days. Detective Markle Bliss didn't like missing teenager cases. In 15 years with the Boston Police Department, he'd seen enough to know that the longer the search dragged on, the less chance of a happy outcome. And in the case of Melody Worthington, it had been 2 days. He was sitting in the kitchen of the Worthington house, looking at a photograph of the girl. Pretty face, long dark hair, dreamy eyes, art college student, talented, promising, preparing for her first exhibition. "Mrs. Worthington." Bliss looked at the woman sitting across from him. Helen was gaunt, dark circles under her eyes. "Tell me again about the night of the disappearance." "I was on duty at the hospital." Her voice sounded mechanical, as if she'd repeated the story 100 times. "Got back about 11 o'clock at night. The house was empty. I didn't worry at first. I thought Melody was at a friend's house, but then I saw her cell phone on the floor." "And your brother? Wesley Whitaker?" "He's gone too. All his stuff is there, even his wallet. Only the Bible is missing." Bliss made a note in his notebook. His brother's story needed separate attention. He'd been released 2 months ago, after 7 years in prison. There was a mention of religious fanaticism in the file. Who was the last person to speak to Melody? Esther Price, her best friend. They spoke on the phone earlier in the evening. Bliss nodded. Esther was supposed to arrive any minute. The patrolman had already canvassed the neighbors. No one had seen anything. Only Mrs. Donovan, from the next street over, remembered seeing an old gray sedan pulling out of the Worthingtons' yard around 6 o'clock that evening. But she didn't remember the license plate number. The ringing of the doorbell interrupted his musings. A red-haired girl with tear-stained eyes stood on the threshold. Esther Price looked as if she had not slept all these days. "Come in, sweetheart." Helen hugged her daughter's friend. "Detective Bliss wants to ask some questions." They settled into the living room. Bliss noted that the girl was more nervous than usual. She kept rubbing the sleeve of her sweater and avoided looking at Mrs. Worthington. "Tell me about your last conversation," the detective asked gently. Esther took a deep breath. "I called her around 5 o'clock this evening. We talked about the exhibition, about her not having time to finish the last painting. And then she stopped talking, biting her lip." "Then what, Esther?" I heard Mr. Whitaker come into the room. He was yelling something about sin. Melody dropped the phone, I heard some fiddling, and then the connection went dead. Bliss pitched forward. Why didn't you report it sooner? I tried calling back many times. Then I went to the house, but no one answered. I hoped. Esther. The detective looked at the girl carefully. There's something you're not telling me. What else do you know? Esther looked at Helen and burst into tears. I'm sorry, Mrs. Worthington. I should have told you sooner. Melody. She was pregnant. A heavy silence hung in the room. Helen went pale, gripping the arm of her chair. What? Her voice shook. How long ago? About 2 months. She wanted to tell you, really wanted to. But something kept getting in the way. And then Mr. Whitaker started acting strange. Bliss made quick notes. A picture was beginning to emerge. A religious fanatic finding out his unmarried niece was pregnant. A classic motif. How long ago did Wesley find out about the pregnancy? He overheard our conversation a few days ago. Esther wiped away tears. After that, Melody said he was acting weird, praying at night, muttering something about purity and sin. The detective pulled out his cell phone and dialed the precinct. This is Bliss speaking. Put out an APB on Wesley Whitaker. Gray sedan, probably an old Ford or Chevy, and send a team to the house. Need to check the suspect's room. Hanging up the phone, he looked at Helen. The woman sat motionless, staring at one point. My brother, she whispered. How could I not have noticed? It's not your fault, Bliss said softly. The important thing now is to find Melody. But deep down he knew. Time was working against them, and the more he learned about Wesley Whitaker, the less he liked the story. The next 3 days turned into an endless series of interrogations, examinations, and searches. Detective Bliss practically took up residence in the Worthington house, turning the kitchen into an impromptu investigative headquarters. The walls were hung with photographs, maps, and records. Wesley Whitaker's room proved to be a real boon to investigators. Walls covered with religious texts written directly on the wallpaper, a diary with rambling entries about sin and redemption, newspaper clippings about the murders. Forensic experts spent an entire day there, photographing every detail. He planned this, Bliss told his partner, Detective Ramirez, as he looked through the photos. Look how the handwriting in the diary gradually changes, becomes more jagged, uneven, classic signs of increasing psychosis. They looked into Whitaker's prison record. 7 years for assaulting a prostitute. He nearly strangled her while screaming about vicious women. In prison, he was assigned to a psychiatric ward, where he spent most of his sentence. Why was he even released? Ramirez shook his head, reading the prison psychiatrist's reports. Good behavior, remorse, active participation in the prison church community. Bliss chuckled bitterly. Classic story. On the 4th day of the search, there was a breakthrough. A patrol car found Whitaker's gray Ford abandoned near the city dump. They found traces of blood in the interior. Bliss arrived on the scene 20 minutes after the report. A chilly November wind was blowing scraps of packages and paper across the vacant lot. The canines were already preparing their dogs for the search. The area is huge, the head canine handler said, looking at the mountains of trash stretching into the distance. It could take days. But it didn't take them a few days. After only 3 hours, one of the dogs had already signaled near a large concrete sewer. Bliss walked to the edge of the concrete structure. Down below, in the shadows, something was whitening. He shined the flashlight and felt his heart clench. Melody Worthington was lying on a pile of trash like an abandoned doll. There were distinctive strangulation marks on her neck. The white sweater she'd disappeared in was stained with earth and blood. Call forensics, Bliss said hoarsely, and the coroner. The next hours passed in feverish activity. The area was cordoned off. A forensics team arrived. Photographic flashes lit up the darkening sky like lightning bolts. Preliminary examination of the body showed death by strangulation. There were no signs of sexual assault. The pathologist confirmed the pregnancy, about 8 weeks. He didn't even try to hide the body, Ramirez remarked as he watched the stretcher being loaded into the morgue van. Just tossed it out like garbage. Bliss was silent. He'd seen a lot of brutality in his 15 years on the job, but this case was special. A religious fanatic obsessed with purity kills his own pregnant niece. A story worthy of an ancient Greek tragedy. The ringing of his cell phone snapped him out of his musings. It was the precinct. Wesley Whitaker had been picked up by surveillance cameras outside a bus station in the suburbs. "Send out an extraction team," Bliss ordered. "He's dangerous and clearly not himself. No unnecessary risk." The sky finally darkened. The floodlights of the police cars illuminated the concrete sewer, turning it into a sinister monument to human cruelty. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. Bliss pulled out his cell phone. He needed to call Helen Worthington, the hardest call of his career. How do you tell a mother that her daughter is dead and the killer is her own brother? In his pocket was the photo he'd found in Melody's room. She was smiling, standing at an easel with an unfinished painting. That exhibition would never happen. A talent cut short by madness and fanaticism. Markel Bliss sat in his office, looking at the crime scene photos spread out on his desk in chronological order. The last weeks of the investigation had added up to a clear picture, a story of religious fanaticism that led to tragedy. Wesley Whitaker was picked up at a bus station in Providence. He offered no resistance. He sat on a bench with a Bible in his hands and mumbled prayers. They found a ticket to Miami in his pocket. When apprehended, he looked haggard but calm. The only thing he demanded was that he be allowed to keep his Bible in his cell. Traces of blood on his clothes matched the samples taken from the car and the scene where the body was found. The detective pored over documents from Whitaker's prison file. Psychiatric reports showed progressive personality disorder with a religious bent. The prison chaplain had noted his overzealousness in matters of faith and obsessions with purity. Bliss recalled questioning the Worthingtons' neighbors. Mrs. Donovan told how, a week before the murder, she had seen Wesley praying in the garden in the middle of the night. He was on his knees in the rain and shouting about the coming retribution. Whitaker's diary, found in his room, became a key piece of evidence. The entries of the past weeks had become increasingly incoherent. "Sin has entered our house," he wrote. "It carries the defilement. God requires cleansing." Psychiatric experts conducted a preliminary assessment of Whitaker's condition. Their conclusion was unequivocal: paranoid disorder with religious delusions, but they found no signs of insanity. He was fully aware of his actions. In the first interrogation, Whitaker was distant, responding with Bible quotes. But when Bliss showed him Melody's picture, something changed in his gaze. "I saved her soul," he said then. "She was pure until she let sin in. I saw it in prison, how vice eats away at souls from the inside out. I couldn't let that happen to her." Bliss remembered how Helen Worthington's hands had trembled as she identified her daughter's body. How Esther Price had sobbed at the funeral, holding her friend's unfinished painting. The college held a memorial exhibition of Melody's work. Her last unfinished painting stood in the center of the room, a cityscape of trees sprouting through concrete buildings, reaching for the sky like praying hands. The case was practically closed. The evidence, the confession, the motive, everything pointed to Whitaker. But Bliss couldn't shake off the heavy feeling. How had the system allowed this to happen? Why hadn't anyone noticed the signs of impending tragedy? In his cell, Whitaker continued to pray. He wrote biblical quotes on the walls, turning his cell into a likeness of that room in his sister's house. The prison psychiatrist noted that he showed no signs of remorse, believing his actions to be righteous. His diary entries formed the basis of the prosecution's case. The prosecutor was confident of the outcome: first-degree murder, with no chance of leniency. Religious fanaticism was no excuse. Bliss organized the photos into a folder. Tomorrow was the last interview. Then the case would go to trial. Another tragedy in the long line of human dramas he'd been through during his years of service. Turning off the light in his office, he held his gaze on Melody's photograph. A talented young woman who had dreamed of becoming an artist. Her life cut short by a warped perception of morality and religious insanity. A story that would haunt him for a long time to come. The phone rang on the desk, a call from the detention center. Wesley Whitaker demanded a priest. He wanted to confess. On the day of Wesley Whitaker's last interrogation, the sky over Boston was covered with leaden clouds. Detective Markel Bliss arrived at the detention center earlier than usual. He wanted to review the case files one more time before entering the interrogation room. Whitaker was waiting for him, sitting at a steel table with handcuffs on. He had gauntleted even more in the 2 weeks of his incarceration, but there was some new, frightening gleam in his eyes. After confessing to the prison chaplain, he agreed to give a detailed testimony for the first time. "I'm ready to talk," he said as Bliss turned on the tape recorder. "God told me to reveal the truth." The story Wesley told was even scarier than the investigation had suggested. He had been regularly raped in the prison where he had served his previous sentence. The abuse and humiliation led to deep psychological trauma, which he tried to drown out with religion. "I saw sin devour souls," he said in a monotone voice. "Every day I watched the fall of human nature. Men who forgot God were turning into animals. I prayed days and nights, asking for protection." After his release, his obsessions with purity and sin only intensified. When he learned of Melody's pregnancy, it was the final straw. "She was so innocent when I came back." Tears came into his voice. "And then I overheard her talking. She didn't know who the father was. She let herself be defiled like those women on the streets. I had to stop it." Bliss listened, making notes. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer. Religious fanaticism multiplied by prison trauma had created a monstrous cocktail in Whitaker's mind. "That night I just wanted to talk to her," Wesley continued. "Explained that it wasn't too late to repent. But when she tried to run away, I saw in her eyes the same fear I'd seen in the mirror all those years in prison, and something broke inside." He described the murder in detail, how he strangled his niece, how he carried the body out the back door, how he drove to the dump. He spoke calmly, as if recounting someone else's actions. "I set her soul free," he finished. "Now she is clean before the Lord." After the interrogation, Bliss sat in the car for a long time, trying to gather his thoughts. Tomorrow the case file would go to the prosecutor's office. Whitaker's confession, backed up by evidence, guaranteed a life sentence. That evening, he went to Helen Worthington's house. She had to be the first to know the truth, not from the news or the court records. The house met him with silence and desolation. Helen sat in her daughter's room, poring over her drawings. The paintings for the failed exhibition still stood against the walls. "Did he confess?" she asked without raising her eyes. Bliss nodded and briefly recounted his brother's testimony, omitting the most gruesome details. Helen listened in silence, only her fingers going over the drawings trembled more and more. "You know," she said when the detective had finished, "I blamed myself, thinking, how could I not see what was happening to him? How did I let him stay in the house? Why didn't I see the fear in my own daughter's eyes?" "It's not your fault," Bliss said softly. "Sometimes the worst monsters hide behind the mask of familial love." The next day, all the newspapers were full of headlines about the case of the religious fanatic. Journalists besieged the Worthington home trying to get comment. Esther Price organized a college fund for victims of domestic violence named after Melody. At the opening, all of her paintings were hung, bright, vibrant canvases full of life, so contrasting with the tragic fate of their creator. The trial lasted only 3 days. Wesley Whitaker received a life sentence without parole. During the announcement of the sentence, he stood with a detached look, silently moving his lips in prayer. Helen sold the house and moved to another town. She said she could no longer live among these walls, where every room reminded her of the tragedy. A year later, Bliss received a letter from prison. Wesley wrote that he found real forgiveness and asked to tell his sister that he prayed for the repose of Melody's soul. The detective tore up the letter before he finished reading it. Sometimes, driving past the old Worthington house, he sees the new tenants, a young family with children. They don't know the history of these walls. They don't know about the talented girl whose life was cut short so early, about the mother who lost her daughter at the hands of her own brother, how religious fanaticism and trauma can turn a man into a monster. Melody Worthington's case is closed, but it will forever remain in the minds of all those who faced this tragedy, a reminder of how thin the line between faith and madness, between love and obsession,